Hello and welcome to the Visual Museum of Women in Christianity series on pilgrimage. As you know, this gallery features beautiful art from all around the world. Contributors to the Visual Museum have made pilgrimages to far off and not so far off lands for the purpose of experiencing art, encountering God in new ways, and learning about Christian women throughout history who have been memorialized and celebrated in different forms of visual art. Many of the women featured in our gallery went on pilgrimages themselves. As we dig into the history and practice of pilgrimage, we will find that it is a spiritual formation practice that can bring us face to face with different forms of artistic representation. And it always leads us to encounters with God. During this series, we will look at pilgrimage in Scripture. We will look at the development of pilgrimage in the early and medieval church. And then our last video will discuss modern pilgrimage and how we can all experience this spiritual practice on some level. Most importantly, we can recognize that our very lives as Christians are pilgrimages. What is pilgrimage? What kind of people are pilgrims? Theologian N.T. Wright describes a pilgrim as someone who goes on a journey in the hope of encountering God or meeting Him in a new way. The journey is more than reaching the destination. It is an embodied experience that involves deeper communion with God along the way. Wright's definition broadens the term enough to be accessible for all believers who choose to embark on spiritual journeys. In Christian George's book, Sacred Travels, he comments that all Christ followers are on pilgrimage. We are on a sacred journey of sanctification and growing closer to God. We are sojourners who must depend on Christ's guidance and navigation as we strive toward the city of God where our true citizenship lies. I think it is important to open our Bibles as we discuss pilgrimage. Scripture is full of pilgrimage. Some are prescribed by God, some commanded, sometimes personal choice, and we read of reluctant pilgrims. In Genesis 12, God sends Abram on a grand pilgrimage from his homeland of Ur to a mysterious new land. Was he fearful or reluctant? From the text, we know that Abraham goes. God promised Abraham that this journey would result in great blessings, and Abram believes God and acts upon that belief. His willingness to be a sojourner and obey God makes him a model of faith and obedience. The story of Exodus and the journey of Moses and the Hebrew people through the wilderness is perhaps the most extensive example of pilgrimage in the Bible. They encountered seasons of hardship and disaster, yet God was faithful in his guidance and provision. The Exodus motif plays a key role in the meta narrative of Scripture and in Christian thought as a paradigm of our Christian journey through a fallen world toward our heavenly goal. Both accounts emphasize the theme of God journeying with his people and stress the importance of being willing to obey and trust God. They are both narratives of God's guidance, protection, and provision. Pilgrimage is an action, it requires movement, and often turns into being more about the transformational process on the journey than the destination itself. The Old Testament prophets were often sent on journeys by God for specific purposes. These journeys turn out to be more about what the Lord does and teaches to and through these prophets, and later us, than the initial purposes of their destination. One of the most reluctant pilgrims we read about in Scripture is Jonah, who flat out refused to obey and trust God, and therefore encountered terrible consequences, but was still used by God for his purposes anyway. The book of Psalms contains pilgrimage psalms. Psalm 23 is considered the most well-known piece of literature of all time, and it speaks of pilgrimage. We will look at this psalm later in the video. Biblical scholars also label Psalms 118 to 134 as pilgrimage psalms, also called Psalms of Ascent. These are psalms that are thought to have been sung or chanted during the Israelites' annual processions from their towns and villages to Jerusalem for the feast celebrations. These psalms proclaim the hope, emotion, and joy that animate the pilgrims along their way. The first pilgrims in the New Testament are the Holy Family. Mary travels to visit Elizabeth. Then she travels with Joseph to Bethlehem. The Magi and the shepherds journey to adore the Christ child. We then read of Mary and Joseph's pilgrimage and presentation of Jesus in the temple and their hasty escape to Egypt. Saul of Tarsus did not intend to be a pilgrim meeting with God when he traveled on the road of Damascus. God can turn our trips into pilgrimages. Saul was going away from the temple, the most holy place in Jerusalem, where Jesus miraculously appeared to him and turned his life around. This can sometimes happen when we are on pilgrimage. Later in Paul's ministry, he would often use the language of both a race and a journey to talk about the path of a Christian. With the incarnation of Jesus, we witness God making a pilgrimage to us. In many ways, the traveling tabernacle, first described in Exodus, was the God of heaven providing a place among humans for his measured presence to be housed. God traveled with the Israelites on their pilgrimage, just as he travels with us. The incarnation of Christ was God coming again to us and with us. John 1:14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelled among us." The word in Greek that is translated mostly as lived or dwelt is the Greek version of the Hebrew word for tent or tabernacle. Jesus, fully God and fully man, gave up heaven to journey and live among us. Jesus used pilgrimage and path terminology often. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the path. He is the track, the straight and narrow. He is both the footpath to the destination and the destination itself. Psalm 23 is so well known to us that I fear that the depth of its application to our everyday spiritual journeys is sometimes overlooked. Scholarship has provided no solid evidence of how or when Psalm 23 was used in temple worship, but there is conjecture that it could have been used as a pilgrimage psalm in connection to travel to Jerusalem for feasts. This pilgrimage aspect to the psalm is the one that I find most translatable to our lives today. Psalm 23 beautifully narrates the spiritual journey of every Christian, both applicable to individual seasons of our lives and our life's chronology in its entirety, as pilgrims on a journey to our heavenly home. David is considered the author of this psalm, and due to his extensive experience as a shepherd, he writes using the metaphor so beautifully. God as shepherd was a well-known trope in ancient Near East cultures. David artistically constructs this psalm around the metaphor as he knows his audience will immediately understand and identify with it. Psalm 23 is a psalm of confidence that shares an overwhelming tone of unshakable trust in God's ability and desire to provide safety and deliverance based not on our circumstances, but on His character and on His name. It is often grouped in a unit, including Psalms 15 through 23, where the theme is paths of righteousness. This path of righteousness is our desired path of pilgrimage. God takes care of us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The Good Shepherd provides bodily care and leads us in the way everlasting. We are embodied souls on a journey. Let's read through Psalm 23 together. This is my personal translation of Psalm 23. As a Hebrew student, I have worked on the translation and exegesis of this psalm for the past few years. You may notice some differences in the English words that I choose to use, and we will discuss some of these in just a minute. A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall lack nothing. He will make me lie down in green pastures. He will lead me beside waters of rest. He will restore my soul. He will lead me in paths of righteousness for the purpose of his name. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they will bring me comfort. You will prepare a table in front of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. Your cup overflows. Surely your goodness and your mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's look at a few of my very favorite parts of this psalm. I have chosen to render the verbs in the first few verses as future tense. He will make me lie down in green pastures. He will lead me. He will restore my soul. The Hebrew presentation of these verbs indicates this future tense, and I think it also fits with David's deep assurance and trust in God that he will continue to provide and to lead David in straight paths. He will restore my soul. There are some interpretive differences on how to translate the word for soul. Is it speaking of a spiritual soul, or is it speaking of more of the physical being of a person? I do not think that we should choose between a spiritual or bodily soul refreshment, as I don't think they can be divided. We are embodied spiritual beings, and our pilgrimage of life requires both our physicality and our inward being. In the discussion of the structure of this psalm, verse 4 has often been regarded as the focal verse, especially the I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I have heard many times in sermons that there are 365 places in Scripture that tell us not to fear, one for every day of the year. Unfortunately, that's not truly correct, but the Bible does plainly teach us that fear should not take charge over us. The way this psalm presents this truth is incredibly poignant when we evaluate the line before it. The psalmist is being led in paths of righteousness for the sake of the Lord's holy name. And these paths have led to the valley of the shadow of death. This can be a tough theological pill to swallow, but because of the Good Shepherd's presence with us there, we can trust completely and fear no evil. At the end of the psalm, at the end of the pilgrim's journey, there's a flip in who is doing the following. All of a sudden, goodness and mercy are following us. These words, goodness and mercy, are covenant language from Exodus 34, words God uses to describe who He is. Psalm 23's pilgrimage has a sure and explicit destination. The ultimate end of the Good Shepherd's leading is into the temple for the presence of God all the days of our lives. Pilgrimage is a spiritual, physical, and emotional journey upward and outward for the purpose of growing closer to our Creator. We have learned that there are many kinds and facets of pilgrimage in Scripture. We have also seen that the most important thing to remember is that God is our focus, and our eternal destination is heaven and the presence of God. We are expectant that what we will experience and learn on our pilgrimages will be transformational. We are all pilgrims through this world. I hope you will join us for the next video in our pilgrimage series, where we will look at the development of Christian pilgrimage in the early church and its great importance in the medieval period. Psalm 119:105 is a beautiful word to pilgrims. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. God bless you, fellow pilgrims.